The rain battered her custom silk gown as she pounded her bruised fists against the heavy oak doors of the venue. Inside, a string quartet played the song meant for her walk down the aisle, but she was locked out. Replaced, betrayed by the man she loved, left to be a public spectacle. Then, the flash of police sirens cut through the storm, followed by a fleet of black Maybachs. The Crown Prince stepped into the rain, looking right at her. Oh! Clara Jenkins stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the bridal suite of the Connaught Hotel in Mayfair, London. The reflection staring back at her was a vision of meticulously curated perfection, the culmination of 18 months of planning and a lifetime of dreaming. Her dress was a custom creation by Vivienne Westwood, a breathtaking silhouette of ivory silk faille with an asymmetrical corset that hugged her waist, cascading into a sweeping train. On her feet were a pair of bespoke Manolo Blahniks, delicate and pearl-encrusted. By all standard metrics, this was the happiest day of her life. She was 28, a respected senior art conservator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and in exactly 3 hours, she was scheduled to marry Preston Reed at Hedser House, a magnificent Georgian estate nestled in the lush Buckinghamshire countryside. Yet beneath the flawless Charlotte Tilbury makeup and the delicate scent of Jo Malone orange blossom, a cold leaden knot of anxiety sat heavy in Clara's stomach. It was a feeling she had been aggressively ignoring for months. Preston, a man she had loved and supported for 5 grueling years, had changed. When they first met, he was a brilliant, albeit struggling software engineer with a dream of launching an AI-driven logistics platform called Aerostream. Clara had been his anchor. While he coded in their cramped flat, she worked double shifts. When the startup was on the brink of bankruptcy, Clara had quietly liquidated £65,000 from her late grandmother's inheritance money, specifically meant for her wedding and future home, to keep Preston's dream alive. She had given him everything: her time, her youth, her finances, her unwavering belief. And it had worked. 6 months ago, Aerostream secured a massive Series B funding round spearheaded by Harrington Capital, a ruthless venture capital firm owned by billionaire real estate and tech mogul Arthur Harrington. Almost overnight, Preston had morphed from a humble, stressed programmer into a Silicon Valley caricature. He traded his worn sweaters for tailored Brioni suits, spent his evenings at exclusive members' clubs, networking, and began returning to their flat at 2:00 a.m. smelling faintly of expensive champagne and Le Labo Santa, the 33, a perfume Clara emphatically did not own. "You're overthinking, Clara," he would say, his tone adopting a new patronizing edge whenever she questioned his absences. "This is what success takes. I'm building our future." But the real shift occurred when she was introduced to Victoria Harrington, the 24-year-old heiress to the Harrington fortune. Victoria was the kind of woman who had never been told no in her life. During an awkward celebratory dinner at Scott's in Mayfair, Clara had watched with a tight smile as Victoria blatantly draped herself over Preston's shoulder, laughing too loudly at his jokes. Victoria had looked at Clara not as Preston's fiancée, but as a temporary inconvenience, an obstacle with an expiration date. Clara had pushed those memories away, throwing herself entirely into the wedding planning. She poured the last remnants of her savings into securing Hedser House. She personally selected the thousands of white hydrangeas and pale pink peonies from McQueen's Flowers. She tasted the tiered lemon elderflower cake. Preston was perpetually too busy to attend the meetings, so Clara planned a wedding for 2, all by herself. "Earth to the bride," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Clara blinked, pulling herself back to the luxurious hotel suite. Her best friend and maid of honor, Sarah, stood in the doorway, holding 2 crystal flutes of Dom Perignon. Sarah looked stunning in an emerald green slip dress, but her brow was furrowed with concern. "You've been staring at that mirror for 10 minutes, Clay," Sarah said softly, handing her a glass. "Are you okay? You look like you're about to walk to an execution, not an altar." "I'm fine," Clara lied, forcing a radiant smile. "Just pre-wedding jitters." The weather isn't helping. She gestured toward the window. The legendary London grey had darkened into a bruised, ominous purple. Rain was beginning to lash against the glass, violently blurring the city below. "The cars are downstairs," Sarah said, checking her phone. "The vintage Rolls-Royce for you, the Range Rovers for the bridesmaids. It's an hour's drive to Buckinghamshire." Preston texted to say he's already at the venue with the groomsmen. Clara exhaled a shaky breath, the knot in her stomach loosening just a fraction. "He's there," she thought. "He's waiting for me. I'm just being paranoid." "Let's go," Clara said, lifting the heavy silk skirt of her gown. "Let's go get married." The journey out of London was painstakingly slow, hampered by the torrential downpour. Clara sat in the spacious cream leather interior of the vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, watching the rain streak across the windows. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers felt like a countdown. She tried to picture Preston standing at the end of the aisle, waiting for her beneath the floral archway she had painstakingly designed, but her mind kept flashing back to the cold, dismissive way he had looked at her the night before. He hadn't stayed with her. He claimed he needed to stay at a hotel near the venue with his best man to focus. As the Rolls-Royce finally turned off the main road and onto the sprawling private tree-lined driveway of Hedser House, Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was it, the culmination of her sacrifices, the beginning of her happily ever after. But as the car rounded the final bend, revealing the magnificent iron gates of the estate, Clara's breath caught in her throat. The heavy, wrought iron gates were firmly shut. Standing in front of them, clad in dark raincoats and holding large umbrellas, were 4 private security guards. They were built like linebackers, their faces stony and unyielding in the downpour. "That's strange," the chauffeur murmured from the front seat, slowing the Rolls-Royce to a halt. "Usually they leave the main gates open for the bridal party." The chauffeur rolled down his window as the head of security approached, rain blowing into the luxurious cabin. "Bridal car," the chauffeur announced cheerfully. "Miss Clara Jenkins." The security guard, a burly man with a thick neck and an earpiece, did not smile. He pulled a laminated clipboard from beneath his coat, his eyes scanning a list. He looked back up, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. "I'm sorry, mate," the guard said over the sound of the rain. "I have a Clara Jenkins on the restricted list. She's not permitted on the premises." Clara felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The champagne in her stomach turned to acid. "I'm sorry what?" Clara leaned forward, her voice trembling. "There has to be a mistake. I am the bride." The security guard shone a small flashlight toward the back seat, illuminating Clara in her Vivienne Westwood gown. He didn't look surprised. He looked pitying. "No mistake, ma'am," the guard replied gruffly. "I have strict instructions from the groom and the event organizers. The gates remain locked. You are not on the guest list." "But it's my wedding," Clara cried out, a sudden blinding panic seizing her. She fumbled with the door handle, practically falling out of the Rolls-Royce into the freezing rain. "Clara, wait!" Sarah yelled, scrambling to follow her with an umbrella. But Clara was already standing in the mud, her bespoke shoes sinking instantly into the wet gravel, the hem of her 15,000-pound silk dress absorbing the dirty water like a sponge. "Let me through," Clara demanded, marching up to the iron bars. Through the gates, up the sweeping driveway, she could see the glowing golden windows of Hedser House. She could see the silhouettes of guests, her guests. Preston's colleagues, her family mingling with glasses of champagne. "Ma'am, step back from the gates," the guard warned, holding up a hand. "If you try to force entry, we will call the authorities. The groom has made it clear you are trespassing." "The groom?" Clara gasped, the cold rain plastering her carefully styled hair to her face. Preston gave you this order." "Yes, ma'am." The guard consulted his list again. "Mr. Preston Reed and the bride, Miss Victoria Harrington." The world stopped spinning. The sound of the rain faded into a high-pitched ringing in Clara's ears. Miss Victoria Harrington. Clara stood frozen before the wrought iron gates, her mind violently rejecting the words that had just been spoken. Victoria Harrington. It couldn't be true. It had to be a sick, twisted joke, a logistical nightmare, a nightmare she would wake up from at any second. "You're lying," Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the storm. "I paid for this venue. I picked the flowers inside that house. My name is on the contract." The head of security, whose name badge read Mitchell, sighed heavily, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Miss, the contracts were transferred yesterday morning to Harrington Capital. All vendors were bought out at triple their rates. Legally, this is a private event hosted by the Harrington family. You need to leave." Sarah had finally caught up, holding a large umbrella over Clara's shivering frame, though the rain was blowing in sideways, rendering it almost useless. Sarah's eyes were wide with a murderous fury. "Are you insane?" Sarah screamed at the guards. "That is her fiancé inside. Open these damn gates right now before I call the police." "Call them," Mitchell said flatly. "Mr. Harrington owns half the private security in London. The police will just escort you off the property for trespassing." Clara ignored them. Her trembling hands reached blindly into the hidden pocket of her dress, pulling out her phone. Her screen was wet, making it difficult to swipe, but she managed to dial Preston's number. Ring. 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 "Hey, you've reached Preston Reed, CEO of Aerostream. Leave a message." She ended the call and dialed again. Voicemail. She dialed Greg, the best man. Voicemail. Through the pouring rain, over the sound of the wind, Clara suddenly heard it. The faint, melodic drift of a string quartet carrying across the lawns from the open terrace doors of the mansion. They were playing Clair de Lune, the exact piece Clara had chosen for her walk down the aisle. A sharp, vibrating buzz in her palm snapped her attention back to her phone. It was a text message from Preston. Clara's vision blurred with rain and tears as she opened it. It was a massive block of text, meticulously typed, devoid of any genuine emotion. It read like a corporate press release. "Preston, Clara. I'm sorry it had to happen this way. I tried to tell you last night, but I couldn't find the words. The Series B funding came with a stipulation. Arthur Harrington required absolute loyalty and integration into his family to release the £50 million capital. He wants his daughter to be part of the empire. Victoria and I are getting married today. I know you planned this day, and I'm sorry to take the venue, but Victoria loved the aesthetic, and her father paid off all your vendors to assume the contracts. I've deposited £100,000 into your account to cover your original investments, and then some. Please don't cause a scene. This is purely business, Clara. I had to secure my legacy. Go home." Clara stared at the glowing screen. "Purely business. I had to secure my legacy. Go home." The sheer audacity, the cold, calculating cruelty of it struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her knees buckled. She didn't just lose her fiancé, she had been erased. Preston and Victoria hadn't just broken her heart, they had stolen her dream, bought out her hard work, and literally locked her out in the rain, to watch from the gates like a beggar. "Clay," Sarah asked, her voice cracking as she saw Clara drop to her knees in the mud. "Clara, what is it? What did he say?" Sarah snatched the phone from Clara's limp hand, scanning the message. A string of vicious, colorful curses erupted from Sarah's mouth. Clara couldn't speak. The shock was paralyzing. 5 years of her life, her savings, her unwavering loyalty reduced to a £100,000 payoff and a locked gate. She looked down at her hands covered in Buckinghamshire mud, resting against the ruined silk of the Vivienne Westwood gown she had starved herself for months to afford. Suddenly a flash of bright light cut through the gloom. Then another, and another. Clara flinched, looking up. A black luxury van had pulled up quietly behind the bridal Rolls-Royce. The side doors slid open, and a half-dozen photographers poured out cameras, raised massive telephoto lenses aimed directly at Clara, kneeling in the mud. "Miss Jenkins." "Over here," a paparazzi shouted, the rapid click, click, click of shutters sounding like gunfire. "How does it feel to be dumped on your wedding day? Clara, is it true Victoria Harrington bought your wedding for 3 times the price? Give us a smile, Clara. Look at the camera." Victoria. Of course, Victoria Harrington hadn't just wanted to steal the wedding, she wanted to utterly destroy Clara's reputation. She had tipped off the British tabloids. By tomorrow morning, Clara's devastated, mud-streaked face would be plastered across the front page of every gossip rag in the country, the jilted conservator and the billionaire heiress. "Leave her alone!" Sarah screamed, dropping the umbrella and stepping in front of Clara, holding her hands up to block the lenses. Get the hell away from her. But there were too many of them. They swarmed the gates like vultures. Clara slowly pushed herself to her feet. She was soaked to the bone. Her elaborate updo had collapsed, wet strands of hair clinging to her pale cheeks. The cold was seeping into her marrow, but it was nothing compared to the ice forming in her chest. She looked past the flashes, past the iron bars, up toward the sprawling estate. On the second-floor balcony, partially shielded from the rain by an awning, stood two figures. Preston, looking immaculate in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, and beside him, wearing a blindingly white custom Vera Wang gown that Clara immediately recognized as the one she had pinned on her mood board, was Victoria Harrington. Victoria was holding a flute of champagne, looking down at the gates. Even from this distance, Clara could see the smug, triumphant smirk on the heiress's face. Victoria raised her glass in a mocking toast toward the gates, then turned and kissed Preston passionately. A fresh wave of camera flashes exploded around Clara, capturing her exact reaction to the kiss. "I am going to die here," Clara thought numbly. "I'm going to die of humiliation in the mud." She turned away, ready to tell Sarah to get them back into the car, ready to flee and never show her face in London again. But as she turned, a sound pierced the cacophony of the storm and the shouting photographers. It was a deep, rhythmic, thunderous hum. The paparazzi froze, lowering their cameras. Even the stoic security guards turned their heads toward the winding country road behind them. The sound of police sirens wailed harsh and commanding. Red and blue lights strobed against the dark, rain-soaked trees, illuminating the gloom. A massive motorcade was speeding down the narrow lane. First came two Metropolitan police motorcycles, their sirens blaring aggressively, forcing the paparazzi van to pull off onto the grass. Following them were four massive jet-black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagons, their windows tinted so darkly they looked like obsidian. But it was the vehicle in the center of the convoy that sucked the air out of the surrounding space. It was a custom Mercedes-Maybach Pullman limousine. It was armored, stretched, and terrifyingly elegant. And fluttering from the right front wing of the Maybach, completely soaked by the rain, but unmistakable to anyone who knew European heraldry, was a royal standard flag, a golden lion rampant on a field of azure. The convoy didn't stop politely behind Clara's Rolls-Royce. The lead G-Wagon roared straight up to the iron gates, its massive grille stopping mere inches from Mitchell, the head of security, forcing the burly man to stumble backward into the mud. The doors of the SUVs flew open in unison. A dozen men, in impeccably tailored dark suits, with discreet earpieces, spilled out into the storm. They didn't carry umbrellas. They moved with lethal, synchronized precision. These weren't rent-a-cops hired by a billionaire venture capitalist. These were Royal Protection Officers, elite government-trained armed security. Clear the perimeter, move. One of the RPOs barked, his voice carrying the sharp authority of a military commander. He forcefully shoved a lingering paparazzi backward, sending the man sprawling onto the wet grass. "Hey, you can't do that," the photographer yelped, clutching his expensive camera. "By order of the Crown, step back immediately, or you will be detained under the Royal Security Act." The officer snapped his hand, resting casually near his hip holster. The photographers, realizing the severity of the situation, scrambled backward in terrified silence. Clara stood frozen, shivering violently in her ruined dress. Sarah gripped her arm, her mouth hanging slightly open. "Clay," Sarah whispered. "What is happening?" Clara had no answer. She watched as an aide sprinted from the front seat of the Maybach, popping open an enormous, heavy-duty black umbrella. He positioned himself by the rear passenger door of the limousine and pulled the heavy door open. A pair of polished, handcrafted John Lobb Oxfords stepped onto the wet tarmac. Then the man emerged. He was strikingly tall, standing well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders encased in a bespoke navy cashmere overcoat over a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His jawline was sharp, his cheekbones aristocratic, and his eyes a piercing storm cloud gray, swept over the chaotic scene with an expression of absolute, terrifying authority. It was Crown Prince Leopold of the Royal House of Valois, heir apparent to one of the wealthiest, oldest, and most reclusive sovereign principalities in Europe. He was a man whose wealth dwarfed Arthur Harrington's billions, a man who dined with heads of state and commanded headlines merely by attending a gala. But Clara didn't know him as Crown Prince Leopold. As those storm-gray eyes locked onto hers, Clara's breath left her lungs in a sharp gasp. 3 years ago. Florence, Italy. Clara had been on a 2-month assignment, restoring a fragile Renaissance fresco in the Galleria dell'Accademia. One rainy afternoon, exactly like this one, she had ducked into a small, obscure café to escape the downpour. She had shared a table with a devastatingly handsome man who introduced himself simply as Leo. For 3 weeks, they had been inseparable. They drank Chianti on hidden terraces, debated art history until dawn, and lost themselves in a whirlwind-consuming romance that felt entirely out of time. Leo was attentive, brilliant, and looked at Clara like she was the only masterpiece in Italy. But one morning, Clara woke up to find an empty bed and a handwritten note. "Clara, my family obligations have called me away. It is a duty I cannot escape. Forgive me, I will find you again. Leo." She had wept, assumed he was a wealthy playboy who got bored and eventually returned to London. She met Preston 6 months later and buried the memory of Leo deep in her heart, chalking it up to a Tuscan fantasy. Now, standing before her, flanked by armed guards and wearing the mantle of royalty, was the ghost of her past. Prince Leopold ignored the flashing lights of the distant paparazzi. He ignored the towering gates of Hedsor House. He ignored the security guards staring at him in slack-jawed awe. He walked directly toward Clara. With every step he took, the air seemed to grow heavier. The sheer magnitude of his presence demanded submission. When he reached her, he stopped, his gray eyes softening violently as they took in her soaked hair, her pale, shivering skin, and the mud caking the hem of her wedding dress. He didn't say a word to her at first. Instead, he reached up, unbuttoning his bespoke cashmere overcoat. In one fluid motion, he slipped it off his shoulders and draped it over Clara. The coat was heavy, radiating his body heat, and smelled intoxicatingly of cedarwood and bergamot. The exact scent she remembered from Florence. "Leo," Clara whispered, her voice cracking, barely believing she wasn't hallucinating from hypothermia. "I told you I would find you again, Clara." Leopold set his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sent a tremor straight down her spine. "Though I admit my timing could have been better." He reached out his thumb, gently wiping a mixture of rain and tears from her cheek. The intimacy of the gesture performed in front of the cameras and the guards was staggering. What are you doing here?" Clara stammered, pulling the massive coat tighter around herself. You're a prince. A detail I intended to explain to you over dinner tonight," Leopold said smoothly, though his eyes burned with a dangerous intensity. "I tracked you to London. I learned of your engagement. I came to stop it. It appears," he glanced dismissively at the locked iron gates, "someone else beat me to the sabotage." Leopold turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on Mitchell, the security guard, who had denied Clara entry. Mitchell instantly shrank back, suddenly looking very small, despite his size. "You?" Leopold's voice cracked like a whip. "Who gave the order to lock this woman out?" Mitchell swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the royal protection officers flanking the prince. "Sir, Your Highness, it was the groom, Mr. Reed, and Arthur Harrington." It's a private event. Leopold's jaw tightened. He looked up at the balcony. Preston and Victoria had stopped kissing. They were now staring down at the gates, their expressions morphed from smug triumph to utter uncomprehending shock as they recognized the royal motorcade and the man standing beside the woman they had just discarded. A private event, Leopold repeated softly, though the menace in his tone was unmistakable. He turned back to Clara. Is your name on the lease for this venue, Clara? Yes, Clara said, finding her voice. I paid the deposit, but Harrington bought out the contracts yesterday. We shall see about that, Leopold murmured. He turned to his lead security officer. Commander Hayes. Your Highness, the towering officer responded immediately. I find these gates offensive, Leopold stated coldly, his eyes locked on the balcony where Preston was now visibly panicking. Open them. If they resist, remove them. Wait, you can't, Mitchell shouted, stepping forward. Mr. Harrington will sue. Commander Hayes didn't even look at Mitchell. He grabbed the burly security guard by the lapels of his raincoat and bodily shoved him aside into the bushes. Two other RPOs stepped up to the wrought iron gates. They didn't look for a key. One of them produced a heavy-duty hydraulic bolt cutter from a tactical bag. Snap! The thick padlock shattered. The heavy iron gates were forcefully pushed open, groaning on their hinges, parting like the Red Sea for the prince's motorcade. Leopold turned his attention back to Clara. He offered her his arm, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with protective fury. Shall we go and crash a wedding, my love? He asked softly. Clara looked at the man who had broken her heart 3 years ago, now standing as her savior in the wreckage of her life. A spark of life, of glorious vindictive fire, ignited in her chest. She slipped her trembling hand through his arm. Let's. The walk up the sweeping gravel-lined driveway of Hedsore House felt like a surreal procession. Clara's bespoke Manolo Blahniks ruined by the Buckinghamshire mud, squelched with every step, but she did not falter. She was anchored by the solid, immovable presence of Crown Prince Leopold. His arm was linked tightly with hers, his heavy cashmere overcoat swallowing her shivering frame, radiating a fierce heat that began to thaw the ice in her veins. Behind them, Sarah marched with her head held high, a feral, triumphant grin spreading across her face. Trailing her were the towering figures of the Royal Protection Officers, a phalanx of silent, tailored lethality, moving in perfect synchronization through the torrential rain. As they approached the main entrance of the Georgian mansion, the sounds of the usurpation became agonizingly clear. Through the grand illuminated windows, Clara could see her vision brought to life and simultaneously corrupted. The thousands of white hydrangeas and pale pink peonies she had spent weeks sourcing from McQueen's flowers cascaded down the grand double staircase. The crystal chandeliers blazed, casting a warm golden glow over the 150 guests mingling in the main hall. Waiters in immaculate white coats circulated with trays of vintage Pole Roger champagne, the exact vintage Clara had selected. It was a masterclass in theft. 2 private security guards stood outside the heavy oak double doors of the entrance. As they saw the royal motorcade's security detail approaching, flanked by the very bride they had been ordered to exile, they stiffened their hands, drifting toward their radios. "Stop right there," the taller of the 2 guards barked, stepping directly in front of the door. "This is a closed private event. Nobody enters without the express permission of Arthur Harrington." Leopold didn't even break his stride. He didn't look at the guard. He merely looked at Commander Hayes. "Clear the threshold," Leopold commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. Hayes and another RPO moved with startling velocity. There was no negotiation, no loud argument. In a blur of motion, the 2 Harrington security guards were swiftly disarmed of their radios, spun around, and immobilized against the limestone pillars of the portico. Leopold stepped up to the massive oak doors. He looked down at Clara, his storm-gray eyes searching her pale face. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, the ruthless prince momentarily vanishing to reveal the tender man she had known in Florence. Clara took a deep breath. The smell of cedar wood and bergamot from his coat filled her senses, grounding her. She thought of the 5 years she had given Preston, the 65,000 pounds she had drained from her grandmother's inheritance, the lonely nights, the anxiety, the absolute humiliation of standing in the mud outside her own wedding. The sorrow evaporated, replaced entirely by a white, hot, magnificent rage. "Open them," Clara said. Commander Hayes gripped the heavy brass handles of the double doors and shoved them inward with enough force to rattle the antique frames. Bang! The sound echoed through the cavernous grand hall like a gunshot. The string quartet positioned on the mezzanine and midway through a lively Vivaldi piece scraped to a discordant, screeching halt. The low roar of laughter and polite high society chatter died instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. 150 pairs of eyes turned toward the entrance. There, framed in the doorway against the backdrop of the raging storm, stood Clara Jenkins. Her 15,000 pounds Vivian Westwood gown was soaked the hem, heavy with brown mud. Her hair was plastered to her neck. But draped over her shoulders was the unmistakable, devastatingly elegant coat of a billionaire royal, and standing beside her, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying power, was Crown Prince Leopold of the House of Valois. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Clara recognized the faces staring back at her. Her Aunt Margaret looking horrified, Greg Preston's best man, whose jaw had practically unhinged, and dozens of tech executives and venture capitalists who recognized exactly who the man beside Clara was. "What is the meaning of this?" A booming voice shattered the silence. The crowd parted as Arthur Harrington pushed his way to the front. He was a formidable man in his early 60s with ruthless, cold blue eyes, a shock of silver hair, and the unmistakable posture of a man who believed he owned the world. He was wearing a bespoke morning suit, his face flushed with sudden aggressive fury. Behind him, hurrying down the grand staircase, came Preston and Victoria. Preston looked like he was going to vomit. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big for him. Victoria, however, was flushed with indignance, clutching the skirt of her Vera Wang gown. "Security," Arthur bellowed, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "Where the hell is my security? Get these people out of here. This woman is trespassing." Leopold stepped forward smoothly, placing himself slightly in front of Clara, shielding her. "Your security," Leopold said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the dead silent hall, "has been relieved of their duties, Mr. Harrington. And if you raise your voice to my fiancé again, I will have my officers remove you from this premises by your necktie." The word fiancé echoed in the grand hall. Clara's heart skipped a terrifying beat, but she kept her face completely impassive. Arthur Harrington stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time, he truly registered the man standing before him. The bravado drained from the billionaire's face, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization. The wealthy tech and real estate mogul recognized apex power when he saw it. Your Highness," Arthur stammered, the color completely washing out of his cheeks. He instinctively lowered his head in a jerky, unpracticed bow. I had no idea you were in London. If my office had known—" "Your office knows nothing of consequence, Arthur," Leopold replied, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. He slowly swept his gaze around the room, taking in the floral arrangements, the opulent decor, and finally settling his lethal stare on Preston Reed. "I came to London to retrieve the woman I love. Imagine my profound displeasure when I found her standing in the rain, outside a venue she paid for, barred by a man who possesses the spine of a jellyfish and the honor of a street thief." Preston flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck. He took a hesitant step forward on the stairs. "Clara," he croaked, his voice cracking. "Clara, please, you don't understand." "Do not speak to her," Leopold commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a threat so profound it silenced the room completely. "You forfeited the right to address her the moment you locked those gates." Victoria Harrington, clearly unused to the dynamics of true power and entirely blind to her father's terror, stomped her foot on the marble stairs. "Daddy, do something!" Victoria shrieked, pointing a manicured, diamond-laden finger at Clara. "She's ruining my wedding. Look at her, she's tracking mud all over the imported rugs. Have her arrested." Arthur Harrington turned to his daughter, his eyes wide with panic. "Victoria, shut up," he hissed. Victoria blinked, stunned. Her father had never, not once in 24 years, told her to shut up. "Your Highness," Arthur turned back to Leopold, his voice adopting a pleading, desperate cadence. "There has been a terrible misunderstanding. Business decisions were made. The contracts for this venue were legally transferred to Harrington Capital. We bought out the vendors. Legally, this is our event." Leopold let out a low, dark laugh that contained absolutely zero amusement. It was the sound of a predator closing its jaws. "Legally," Leopold mused, testing the word. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a slim, black, encrypted mobile phone. He tapped the screen once and held it out to Commander Hayes. "Commander, put Chancellor Dubois on speakerphone." Hayes took the phone, pressed a button, and held it up. The quiet hum of an international connection filled the room, followed by the crisp, authoritative voice of the Royal Chancellor of the Valois Trust in Geneva. "Your Highness," the voice echoed, "I await your instruction." "Dubois," Leopold said, his eyes locked dead onto Arthur Harrington's face. "The Valois Sovereign Wealth Fund is the primary controlling limited partner of Harrington Capital's European Tech Sector Fund, is it not?" Arthur Harrington staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he had been shot. A collective gasp rose from the tech executives in the crowd, who immediately understood the implications. "Yes, Your Highness," Chancellor Dubois replied over the speaker. "The Crown holds a 73% stake in Harrington Capital's liquidity for that specific sector. We are their primary capital source." Preston, standing on the stairs, suddenly gripped the banister, his knuckles turning entirely white. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. The £50 million Series B funding for Aerostream. He had sold out Clara, sold out his soul to secure that money from Arthur Harrington. "Excellent," Leopold said, his voice glacial. "Effective, immediately freeze all assets tied to Harrington Capital. Initiate a full forensic audit of their operations, and withdraw the £50 million allocated for the Series B funding of an entity known as Aerostream." "No!" Preston screamed, his voice shattering in pure agony. He scrambled down the remaining stairs, ignoring Victoria, pushing past Arthur until he fell to his knees on the marble floor just a few feet from Leopold and Clara. "No, please, that's my company. That's my life's work. You can't do this." "It is already done, Your Highness," Dubois confirmed calmly over the phone. "The transfer to Aerostream has been aborted. Harrington Capital's accounts are frozen, pending investigation." "Thank you, Dubois." "That will be all," Leopold said. Hayes ended the call and slipped the phone away. The silence in the room was now absolute, broken only by the pathetic, heavy panting of Preston Reed, kneeling on the floor. In less than 60 seconds, Crown Prince Leopold had dismantled Arthur Harrington's empire and utterly vaporized Preston's entire future. "You see, Mr. Harrington," Leopold said, looking down at the billionaire who was now sweating profusely, "you do not own this venue. You bought it with my money, and I am repossessing it." Leopold turned his gaze down to Preston. The tech CEO was trembling violently, tears streaming down his face, completely ignoring the massive crowd of investors and family watching his total humiliation. "Clara," Preston begged, looking up at her with red, desperate eyes. "Clara, please, tell him to stop. I did it for us. I did it because Arthur said he wouldn't fund Aerostream unless I married Victoria. I was backed into a corner. I love you. I always loved you." Clara stared down at the man she had spent 5 years of her life loving. She looked at his expensive, tailored tuxedo bought with the success she had financed. She looked at his tear-stained face, searching for the man who used to stay up late coding in their cramped flat, the man she had sacrificed her inheritance for. He wasn't there. He hadn't been there for a long time. You didn't do it for us, Preston, Clara said. Her voice was remarkably steady, ringing with a profound, unshakable clarity. You did it for yourself. You didn't build a legacy today. You sold your soul to the highest bidder. Clara, please, Preston sobbed, reaching out a hand to touch the ruined hem of her dress. Before he could make contact, Commander Hayes stepped forward, his heavy tactical boot stomping down hard onto the marble floor inches from Preston's fingers. Preston recoiled in terror. Do not touch her, Hayes warned, his voice dangerously low. Victoria, unable to process the total collapse of her perfect day and her father's financial ruin, let out an ear-piercing scream of pure frustration. This is insane. You can't just ruin my life because of this museum rat. Leopold's eyes snapped to Victoria. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Miss Harrington, Leopold said, his voice dangerously soft. I suggest you take whatever remains of your shattered dignity, gather your father, and vacate my venue before I have you arrested for grand larceny concerning the theft of my fiancé's intellectual property and event contracts. Arthur Harrington didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Victoria's arm, hauling her roughly toward a side exit, ignoring her hysterical protests. The power dynamic had shifted so violently, so completely, that the billionaire looked like a frightened old man fleeing a burning building. Leopold looked back down at Preston, who was still kneeling completely broken, weeping onto the marble. You owe Clara £65,000 for her initial investment, plus a substantial return for the emotional distress you have caused. Leopold stated, his tone businesslike and ruthless. My lawyers will be in touch. If you do not pay, I will personally ensure that Aerostream is not only bankrupt, but that you are barred from operating a registered business in the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States for the rest of your natural life. Leopold paused, letting the absolute destruction of Preston's reality sink in. Now, the prince commanded, get out of her sight. Preston hauled himself to his feet. He couldn't look Clara in the eye. He couldn't look at anyone. The venture capitalists he had desperately tried to impress were staring at him with a mixture of disgust and pity. He turned and practically ran toward the back of the hall, disappearing into the shadows of the estate he had tried to steal. Clara stood in the center of the grand hall. The usurpers were gone. The guests, a mix of her own bewildered family and Preston's now deeply uncomfortable colleagues, remained staring in stunned silence. She looked around at the white hydrangeas, the sweeping staircase, the crystal chandeliers. It was beautiful. It was exactly what she had designed, but it no longer felt like hers. The venue felt tainted, a beautiful mausoleum to a dead relationship. Clay, Sarah whispered, stepping up beside her, placing a gentle hand on her back. Are you okay? Clara took a deep breath, exhaling a long, shuddering sigh. The adrenaline that had propelled her into the hall was beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the dull, throbbing ache of a broken heart. I don't want to be here anymore, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. I want to go. Leopold immediately stepped closer, his arm wrapping securely around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The protective gesture sent a wave of warmth through her shivering body. Then we leave, Leopold said firmly. He looked over the crowd, his commanding gaze sweeping the room. The event is cancelled. You will all return to your homes. Security will escort you off the premises. Without another word, Leopold turned Clara around, guiding her back toward the heavy oak doors, back out into the storm. Sarah followed closely behind, flanked by the RPOs. As they emerged from the mansion, the flashing lights of the paparazzi, who had been held back at the broken gates by the remaining royal guards, illuminated the darkness like a Strauss light. They had undoubtedly heard the screaming and seen Arthur Harrington flee. Shields up, Commander Hayes ordered. Instantly, the RPOs snapped open large, black, bulletproof umbrellas, creating an impenetrable tunnel of fabric and bodies, completely blocking the paparazzi's view of Clara. Protected from the rain and the lenses, Leopold guided her down the steps and directly into the waiting armored Maybach. The heavy door slammed shut behind them instantly, cutting off the roar of the rain and the shouting of the press. Inside the Maybach was a sanctuary of absolute silence and unbelievable luxury. The air smelled of expensive leather and subtle cologne. Soft, ambient amber lighting illuminated the spacious cabin. Clara sank into the plush, heated leather seat, pulling Leopold's heavy cashmere coat tighter around herself. She stared blankly at the privacy partition, separating them from the driver. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The massive vehicle glided smoothly down the dark country roads, heading back toward London. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the wet asphalt was the only sound. Clara's mind was a chaotic whirlwind. Preston's betrayal. The humiliation at the gates. The devastating display of power. The fact that the man sitting next to her, the man she had mourned for 3 years as a lost summer romance, was actual, literal royalty. "You're a prince," Clara finally whispered, breaking the heavy silence. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. "I am," Leopold replied. His voice was no longer the terrifying rumble that had dismantled Arthur Harrington. It was soft, hesitant, almost vulnerable. "You lied to me in Florence." "I omitted the truth," Leopold corrected gently, turning in his seat to face her. "Clara, please look at me." Slowly, she turned her head. In the soft amber light of the cabin, she saw the storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams. They were filled with an ancient, profound sorrow. "When we met in Italy," Leopold began, his voice thick with emotion, "I was escaping. My life had been mapped out for me since the day I was born. Every decision, every duty, every alliance was predetermined. Those 3 weeks with you in Florence, they were the only time in my life I was simply a man. I was just Leo, and I fell in love with you, with a ferocity that terrified me." Clara swallowed, hard tears pricking her eyes. "Then why did you leave? Why did you vanish in the middle of the night with just a note?" Leopold ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting it. He looked suddenly exhausted. "The night before I left, I received a call on an encrypted royal line. My father, the king, had suffered a massive stroke. He was not expected to survive the week. I was summoned back to Geneva immediately to assume the regency. The principality was on the brink of a succession crisis. I had no time to explain, and if I had told you who I was, you would have been thrust into a media circus and political crossfire that you were not prepared for." He reached out his large, warm hand, gently covering her cold, trembling ones, resting in her lap. "I intended to secure my position and return for you." Leopold continued, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "But my father lingered in a coma for 2 years. The political instability required my absolute undivided attention. I couldn't leave the palace. By the time he passed away and the crown was secure, I hired private investigators to find you." Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek. "And they found me with Preston." Leopold's jaw tightened at the name. "Yes, they found you living in London, engaged to a tech developer. The report said you were happy. You were building a life. Who was I to storm back into your world and shatter it with my crown and my chaos? I loved you enough to let you go." "Then why are you here?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "Because I kept tabs on him," Leopold admitted, his eyes darkening with protective anger. "When Harrington Capital approached Aerostream, my financial ministers flagged the deal because of my personal interest. I read the stipulations Arthur Harrington placed on the funding. I knew Preston was going to betray you. I boarded my private jet the moment I found out. I swore I would not let another man destroy the light in your eyes. I wish I had arrived an hour earlier, before you had to stand in that rain." Clara stared at him, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of his confession. He hadn't abandoned her out of boredom. He had left to rule a country, and he had stayed away because he thought she was happy. And the moment he knew she was in danger, he had crossed Europe to save her. She looked down at his hand, covering hers. It felt solid. Real. A stark contrast to the hollow promises, Preston had fed her for years. "Where are we going?" Clara asked softly. "My private residence in Mayfair," Leopold replied. "Sarah is in the SUV behind us. She'll be joining you. There are hot showers, dry clothes, and a private chef waiting. Tomorrow, if you wish, I will put you on a plane to anywhere in the world. You never have to see me again. But tonight you are safe." Clara looked out the tinted window. The dark, rural roads were giving way to the brilliant, blurry streetlights of London. Her wedding was dead. Her old life was in ashes. But as she leaned her head back against the plush headrest, breathing in the scent of cedarwood and bergamot, Clara realized something profound. She wasn't heartbroken. She was free. The Maybach glided to a halt in front of a sprawling, imposing townhouse on Charles Street, deep in the ultra-exclusive heart of Mayfair. It was a property that didn't merely whisper wealth, it hummed with generations of quiet, untouchable power. Flanked by Corinthian columns, the residence was completely shielded from the prying eyes of the public by towering wrought iron fencing and an imposing security presence. Clara was ushered inside with the utmost discretion. The interior was a masterpiece of understated luxury, original Georgian cornicing walls, adorned with genuine Turner and Gainsborough oil paintings, and the pervasive comforting warmth of a roaring fireplace in the grand reception room. A housekeeper named Mrs. Higgins immediately whisked Clara upstairs to the primary guest suite, a breathtaking room dominated by a four-poster bed and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private garden. For the next hour, Clara existed in a state of numb automation. She peeled off the ruined £15,000 Vivienne Westwood gown, leaving it in a muddy heap on the pristine marble floor of the bathroom, a physical shedding of her old life. She stood under the scalding spray of a rainfall shower until her skin turned pink, washing away the Buckinghamshire mud, the chilled rain, and the lingering scent of Preston's betrayal. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, she found draped over the vanity, she found Sarah sitting on the edge of the velvet chaise lounge in the bedroom. Sarah had clearly already showered and changed into borrowed silk pajamas, but her face was pale, her eyes fixed entirely on the glowing screen of an iPad. "Sarah," Clara asked softly, toweling her wet hair, "what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah looked up, her expression a turbulent mix of disbelief and mounting, visceral fury. "It's Preston," she spat the name, tasting like poison. "He isn't going down quietly, Clay. He's panicking." Clara's stomach, finally settling from the evening's chaos, gave a dangerous lurch. "What has he done?" Sarah turned the iPad around. The screen was open to the Daily Mail's website. The headline splashed in massive sensationalist font across the homepage was a gut punch. Tech CEO jilted at the altar, claims fiancé sabotaged Buckinghamshire wedding with mystery sugar daddy to extort millions. Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the bullet points beneath the horrific headline. Preston, terrified by the sudden freezing of his Series B funding and the complete collapse of his social standing, had immediately deployed a desperate scorched earth PR tactic. He had leaked a fabricated, incredibly detailed narrative to the tabloids. In his version of events, Clara was a manipulative, money-hungry gold digger who had been secretly having an affair with an unnamed European billionaire. According to Preston CKA, Clara had deliberately staged the showdown at the gates of Hedsor House with her paramour to humiliate him publicly and extort £100,000 from him, conveniently twisting the payoff he had sent her into a blackmail demand. Worse still, the article featured strategically cropped photos from the paparazzi at the gates. They showed Clara in the mud, crying, but cut out Preston and Victoria on the balcony completely. The images framed Clara as unhinged, while the photos of her getting into the Maybach with Leopold were captioned with vicious speculation. "He posted a video on X too," Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. He's sitting in a hotel room, looking like a total victim, crying about how you broke his heart and tried to ruin Aerostream. The tech bros in his replies are already eating it up. They're doxing your social media, Clara. They're calling you a corporate spy. Clara collapsed onto the edge of the bed. The sheer sociopathic audacity of it was staggering. Preston had stolen her money, stolen her wedding, replaced her with an heiress, and now he was trying to destroy her professional reputation and her sanity to save his own skin. As a senior art conservator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, her entire career relied on a pristine, trustworthy reputation. This scandal would end her. I have to release a statement, Clara said, her voice trembling as panic finally began to set in. I have the texts, Sarah. I have the receipts of the venue deposits. A statement won't be necessary, a deep, resonant voice said from the doorway. Clara and Sarah both jumped. Crown Prince Leopold stood at the threshold of the suite. He had changed out of his wetsuit and was now wearing dark, tailored trousers and a simple black cashmere sweater that made his broad shoulders look even more intimidating. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, but his storm-gray eyes were devoid of any warmth. They were fixed on the iPad in Sarah's hands with a terrifying, absolute coldness. He has chosen war, Leopold murmured, stepping into the room. The air pressure seemed to drop around him. How magnificently foolish of him. Leo, my career. Clara started, a tear finally escaping her eye. If the museum sees this... Leopold crossed the room in 3 long strides. He set his glass down, sat beside her on the bed, and gently cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Clara, listen to me. Leopold said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded absolute belief. By sunrise, Preston Reed will not have a reputation, a company, or a platform left to speak from. You are under my protection now, and the House of Valois does not lose. He stood up and pulled a sleek phone from his pocket. Hayes, Leopold barked into the receiver. Wake up Carter Ruck, all senior partners. I want them in my study in 20 minutes, and get Dubois back on the line. It's time to release the hounds. The counteroffensive did not begin with a press release. It began with a legal and financial carpet bombing the likes of which London's corporate sphere had rarely seen. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Clara sat in the opulent mahogany-paneled library of the townhouse nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea. Across the massive desk sat Leopold, flanked by 3 terrifyingly sharp lawyers from Carter Ruck, London's most feared defamation and privacy law firm. The injunctions have been served to the Daily Mail, The Sun, and all major social media platforms. The lead solicitor, a sharp-featured woman named Eleanor Vance, stated calmly, adjusting her glasses. Given the libelous nature of Mr. Reed's claims and the irrefutable digital evidence we provided, the articles are being scrubbed as we speak under threat of ruinous litigation. Good, Leopold said, sipping his black coffee. But erasing his lies is merely defense. I want his offense dismantled. Dubois, report. The speakerphone on the desk crackled to life. Your Highness, the Chancellor's voice echoed. Our forensic accountants worked through the night. When Harrington Capital initiated the due diligence for Aerostream Series B funding, our auditors flagged several anomalies in Mr. Reed's code architecture and ledger. Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. Anomalies. Fraud. Miss Jenkins, Dubois clarified. Blatant corporate fraud. Mr. Reed vastly inflated Aerostream's user metrics and artificially generated revenue streams to secure the £50 million valuation. Furthermore, we traced the £65,000 you personally invested. He did not use it for server space as he claimed. He used it to pay off his own private gambling debts from 3 years ago. A cold shock washed over Clara. The late nights, the stress, the supposed server crashes. It had all been a lie to cover a gambling addiction she knew nothing about. She felt a wave of nausea followed instantly by a sharp, crystallizing sense of absolute detachment. Preston wasn't just a coward, he was a criminal. We have forwarded the complete audit file to the Financial Conduct Authority and the Fraud Division of the Metropolitan Police. Dubois continued. Simultaneously, we leaked a summarized, legally bulletproof dossier of this fraud to the Financial Times. As if on cue, Sarah burst into the library clutching her phone. "Turn on BBC News," Sarah practically shouted. Leopold pressed a button on a remote, and a large flat-screen TV descended from a hidden recess in the ceiling. The morning news anchor appeared, looking gravely serious. "Breaking news this morning in the tech sector," the anchor announced. "Preston Reed, CEO of the logistics startup Aerostream, has been taken into police custody at a boutique hotel in Mayfair. Sources at the Financial Conduct Authority confirm an investigation into massive wire fraud and investor deception." The screen cut to live footage outside the hotel. The very paparazzi that had tormented Clara the night before were now swarming Preston. He was being escorted out of the lobby by two plainclothes detectives, looking disheveled, completely broken, and desperately trying to hide his face from the flashing cameras. Furthermore, the anchor continued, "Statements released by Carter Ruck on behalf of Miss Clara Jenkins have entirely debunked Mr. Reed's social media claims from last night. Texts and financial records confirm Reed maliciously locked his fiancée out of their wedding venue to marry the daughter of venture capitalist Arthur Harrington, a merger that has spectacularly collapsed overnight." Clara stared at the screen. It was over. The checkmate was absolute. Preston had tried to bury her in the mud, but he had dug his own grave instead. Leopold dismissed the lawyers with a nod. Within moments, the heavy library doors clicked shut, leaving Clara and Leopold alone in the quiet room. The prince walked over to the TV and turned it off, plunging the room back into a serene silence. He walked over to Clara's chair, extending a hand to her. She took it, letting him pull her gently to her feet. He led her toward the French doors that opened onto a private stone balcony overlooking the frost-kissed trees of Hyde Park. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, brilliant blue winter sky. "It's done," Leopold said softly, standing close behind her, his chest a solid, reassuring wall against her back. "His shadow will never touch you again." Clara looked out at the sprawling city. For the first time in 18 months, the heavy, suffocating knot of anxiety in her chest was entirely gone. She breathed in the cold morning air, feeling lighter than air. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara whispered, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "You saved my life, Leo." "I merely cleared the stage, Clara," Leopold replied, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. "You are the one who walked away from the wreckage with your head held high. You are the strongest woman I have ever known." He gently turned her around, so she was facing him. The ancient sorrow that had plagued his storm-gray eyes the night before had vanished, replaced by a tentative burning hope. "I told you yesterday that I could put you on a plane to anywhere in the world," Leopold said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, "and that offer stands. But my greatest hope, Clara, is that you choose to stay in my world." Clara looked up at the man who had loved her from afar, who had crossed a continent to protect her, and who had laid a tech empire to waste just to see her smile. The memories of Florence the Chianti, the laughter, the deep, undeniable soul connection came flooding back, not as a ghost of the past, but as the foundation of her future. She reached up her fingers, threading into his dark hair, and pulled him down toward her. "I'm done running, Leo," Clara breathed against his lips. "And I think I'd make a rather excellent princess." Leopold smiled, a breathtaking, genuine expression that reached his eyes before capturing her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of fiercely guarded, unconditional love. If Clara's journey from a heartbroken bride in the mud to a triumphant woman beside a crown prince kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense, twist-filled stories of betrayal, power, and ultimate revenge. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a good karma comeback. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic tales. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Tell us down in the comments section right now, and stay tuned for more.